In the heart of Huntington, surrounded by gentle hills and quiet, winding streams, I grew up far removed from the bustling city life. Our small, weathered house with its cracked wooden floors and old windows overlooking endless fields was an entire world to me. Everything here seemed so simple, yet profoundly deep, a world that belonged only to us. This house was filled with the warmth of family love, radiating through every crack in the walls and infusing every moment of our lives. My parents weren't rich in money, but they were rich in wisdom and kindness. My father, a local carpenter with rough, calloused hands, could create wonders out of wood. Despite the ruggedness of his work, his touch was always astonishingly gentle, filled with genuine love. He taught me perseverance, patience, and humility, values that became the foundation of my character. My mother, a schoolteacher, filled our home with books and stories. She instilled in me a love for reading and ignited a desire to dream. I remember how she would read me tales of far-off lands and brave heroes in the evenings, and in my imagination, worlds came alive where I could be anyone. Life in Huntington was unhurried, as if nature itself set the rhythm of our existence. Here, joy was found in the simplest things: the fresh scent of the earth after rain, the soft rustling of leaves underfoot, and the morning songs of birds. One day, my life changed. It happened on the day I first met James. He was unlike anyone else. Tall, with a gentle smile and an insightful gaze, he seemed to have come from another world. A visitor from the city, he carried with him an air of refinement, yet he was surprisingly humble. His family was well known in business circles, their wealth and influence a topic of conversation even here in Huntington. But James himself seemed disconnected from that hectic life. Our first conversations were cautious, as if we were testing the waters of two entirely different worlds. He spoke of the city, its endless pace, dazzling lights, and limitless opportunities. I shared stories of our quiet corner, of the harvest festival when the whole town came together, of walks along the stream, and of neighbors always ready to lend a hand. We often met at the lake in the local park. That spot became special to us. There, on an old wooden bench, we would talk for hours. The calm surface of the water mirrored the sky like a mirror, and it seemed as though our dreams were hidden in those reflections. It was there that James once said words that changed me forever. "Laura," he said, his voice soft but deep, "I've always been surrounded by people who only care about money and status. But you've shown me a different world. You've shown me what it means to truly live." Those words awakened something new in me, something I had never considered before. In James, I saw a man who was searching not for wealth but for simple happiness. His confession was sincere, and I felt something inside me tighten with warmth and tenderness. In our conversations, he began to mention his family more often, especially his mother. Her image, elegant and stern, formed in my mind. She was a woman with high expectations, and this troubled James. "I'm just worried about how she'll react to us," he said one day, and I detected a note of anxiety in his voice. I took his hand, feeling a slight tremor. It was an important moment. "We'll face it together, James," I said. "What matters is us, not someone else's expectations. Love doesn't depend on background or wealth. It's about being there for each other, no matter what." He looked at me with gratitude, and in that moment, I realized our bond had grown into something more than mere affection. It was the beginning of something greater than ourselves. The day James proposed was as modest as our love. There were no fireworks or grand gestures, just a quiet evening by the lake, where the reflection of the setting sun played on the water like ripples in a gentle breeze. He knelt before me, holding a delicate ring with a simple yet elegant stone. "Laura," his voice trembled, and his eyes held such sincerity that I felt warmth fill every cell of my being. "You haven't just changed how I see life. You've shown me what it means to love. Let me spend all my days with you." I was at a loss for words. I nodded, unable to speak, and as he slid the ring onto my finger, I knew this was just the beginning. We embraced, and it felt as though the entire world had paused to honor the moment. Later that evening, I was to meet his family. As the car approached the large estate, I felt my palms grow damp with nervousness. The grand building, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and wrought iron gates, looked like something out of another world. Inside, I felt uneasy, as though I had stepped into a theatrical set that hid something cold behind its grandeur. "Just be yourself, Laura," James said, squeezing my hand. "You've already won my heart. Nothing else matters." I gave him a faint smile, but my thoughts revolved around one question: what if I wasn't enough? The mansion was magnificent: high ceilings, enormous chandeliers, and paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls. We were led to the dining room, where a table covered with a pristine white tablecloth was laden with exquisite dishes. His mother, Lady Eleanor, sat at the head of the table. She was a tall woman with perfect posture, dressed in a tailored suit that emphasized her status. Her gaze, fixed on me, was as cold as a winter morning. "So this is Laura," she said, giving me a scrutinizing look. "An interesting choice, James." Those words cut through me like a blade. Her tone was polite, but beneath it lay a bitter mockery. I tried not to show my discomfort and smiled, but inside, everything tightened. Dinner began with luxurious dishes whose names I couldn't even pronounce. Eleanor, noticing my hesitation, leaned in closer with a practiced smile and said, "I imagine these dishes might be too refined for your taste. We can order something simpler." "Thank you," I replied, striving to sound firm. "I'm always happy to try something new." Her remarks grew increasingly pointed. She made a comment about my dress, simple but neat. "It must be difficult to find suitable attire in your town," she said, looking me over from head to toe. "On such a modest budget, you still managed." I clenched my hands under the table but held my ground. James tried to change the subject, but Eleanor didn't let the opportunity slip by. "Tell me about your parents, Laura. It's always so fascinating to learn about someone's background." "My father is a carpenter, and my mother is a schoolteacher," I replied honestly. "How touching," she said, her tone sweet but cutting. "Hard-working people. Though, of course, they couldn't have given you much of a financial head start." Each word of hers, wrapped in a veneer of politeness, was sharp. She mentioned my small hometown, my humble roots, and even insinuated that I would struggle to adapt to a new lifestyle. James struggled to conceal his frustration, and his attempts to defend me only seemed to provoke her further. His father, Richard, however, remained composed. When the evening ended, he pulled me aside. "You held your own well, Laura," he said with a kind smile. "Don't let her break you. She'll come around." In the car, James grabbed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Laura," he said, his voice full of sincerity. I didn't expect her to be so harsh. I exhaled, feeling the sting of her words mingling with a growing resolve. "It's okay, James," I said, looking at him. "I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I love you, and that's what matters most to me." That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Eleanor's words had left a mark, but they hadn't broken me. Instead, they had planted a seed of determination. I realized that this encounter was a test, not just for me but for our love. And I was ready to face it. The day of the wedding, which was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, arrived under a bright morning sun. But despite this, I couldn't shake the anxious feeling that had settled deep inside me. The air was thick with mixed emotions: excitement, hope, but also a faint shadow of tension that I tried to ignore. I spent most of the morning surrounded by my family, who helped me get ready. My mother adjusted the hem of my dress, while my father, silently smiling, held my hand as if reluctant to let go. My dress, simple yet elegant, with delicate lace and light draping, reflected who I was. I had chosen it not to make a statement, but because it truly felt like me. In it, I felt authentic. But as I entered the hall where the guests had gathered, Lady Eleanor's gaze made me feel uneasy. She sat at the front of the room, her back straight, her expression inscrutable, as if she had deliberately prepared to make an impression. The ceremony was heartfelt. James stood beside me, his eyes filled with love and certainty, keeping me grounded. We exchanged vows, and in that moment, I felt as if nothing, no words, no judgment, could break our bond. Yet even in those precious minutes, I couldn't completely set aside my thoughts about the reception to come. I knew that every step, every choice I made, would be scrutinized. When the wedding reception began, the room filled with light and laughter. Guests enjoyed the carefully chosen fine dining and raised their glasses to our happiness. Everything seemed to be going smoothly, until it was time for the speeches. I knew Lady Eleanor wouldn't miss the chance to speak, but I couldn't have anticipated that her words would become yet another trial. She stood up, elegant and confident, her voice loud and clear, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone carrying its usual cold politeness, "we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of my son, James, with Laura, a person from another circle." Her words, like sharp needles, pierced the room, leaving the underlying meaning impossible to miss. She paused, letting her statement hang in the air. "As a mother," she continued, with a faint bitterness in her tone, "I have always dreamed that my son would find a partner who shares our lifestyle and our values. But fate, as you can see, sometimes has its surprises." James tensed, his hand, which had been resting on mine, trembled slightly. I felt a wave of shame and anger wash over me, but I didn't let those emotions take control. I knew she was waiting for my reaction, and I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Marian continued, her tone calm, yet her words were as sharp as ice. "Laura," she said, pausing to look at me, "you come from a different world, but now you are part of our family. And while your journey to this table was undoubtedly challenging, I trust that you will make every effort to live up to the standards expected of you." Her words caused a ripple of unease among the guests. James stood up abruptly, his eyes blazing with anger. "That's enough, Mother," he said loudly, his voice echoing through the room. "You speak of Laura as if she has something to prove to you. But she is my wife, and I will not allow you to question her worth." Marian raised an eyebrow slightly, as if her son had dared to defy her for the first time. The tension in the room became palpable, and I felt the weight of all eyes on us. "James, dear," she replied softly, folding her arms across her chest, "I am merely expressing my concern for your life together. Isn't that what a loving mother does?" I looked at James. His eyes were filled with pain, mixed with determination. His support was my shield, but I knew this was the moment when I needed to speak up for myself. "Marian," I began, doing my best to make my voice sound firm yet respectful, "I appreciate your words. And while I understand that our worlds are indeed different, I believe that love knows no boundaries. James chose me, and I chose him. And, believe me, I will do everything to prove that this was the right choice. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Her expression remained unreadable, but a ripple of approving applause broke out in the room. People began murmuring, and I sensed that the tension in the air had lessened slightly. James looked at me with gratitude, and his father, Richard, gave me a small nod and a faint smile, as if to say, "You did well." The whispers among the guests, spreading like a cold breeze, stung my skin. Every word from Marian cut like a sharp blade, leaving deep, invisible wounds. Her tone carried a harshness masked by strained politeness, and every word seemed aimed directly at my self-esteem. While some might admire James for his generosity, she said with a restrained smile, "For lifting," she paused dramatically, as if deliberately, "a beggar from the street, we must remember our family's reputation. Our family has always upheld high standards, and allowing them to be undermined by someone who seeks to rise at our expense would be reckless. Those words pierced me to my core. I felt my knees weaken and my heart race in a frantic rhythm. I glanced around. The faces of the guests reflected a mixture of shock, discomfort, and awkwardness. Some avoided looking at me, while others whispered to their neighbors, casting quick glances in my direction. My breathing became shallow, and I struggled to suppress the urge to run out of the room. James's eyes burned with fury. He clenched his teeth, and I could see his hand trembling. He took a step forward, ready to say something, but at that moment, I felt my mother's hand tighten around mine. I turned to her. Her eyes held so much: hurt, pain, and, above all, unwavering support. She, more than anyone, knew I could withstand this blow. Yet despite her silent encouragement, I felt as if I were being torn apart inside. This was supposed to be the day of our love, not a public humiliation. To our future, Marian concluded with a forced smile, raising her glass. Her voice rang like cold metal in the silent room. The silence that followed her words was deafening. A few awkward claps broke out, but they were far too few to fill the void. James stood, his fists clenched, his voice trembling as he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, Laura. This is not what I wanted you to experience today," he said, looking directly into my eyes. His face was a mixture of pain and guilt. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt tight, and I was on the verge of breaking down. At that moment, a firm but calm voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Good evening," said James's grandmother, Mrs. Joyce, as she rose from her seat. Her voice, steady and commanding, drew the attention of everyone in the room. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant bun, and the seriousness of her expression made it clear that her words would not go unheard. "I have something important to say," she began, casting a brief glance at Marian, who by then was visibly tense. "Tonight, we have witnessed unfair criticism. Criticism that no one deserves, least of all on their wedding day." I lifted my head, feeling a faint spark of hope ignite within my chest. James turned toward his grandmother, his eyes reflecting a mix of surprise and gratitude. Mrs. Joyce stepped forward, her gaze unwavering as it rested on Marian, and continued. "It seems that some of us have forgotten where they came from. Allow me to remind everyone, especially you, Marian. Before becoming the lady of this house, you were a maid working under this very roof. It was here that you met your husband." A collective gasp of astonishment rippled through the room. Marian's face went pale. Her typically impenetrable expression now showed clear signs of shock and confusion. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For a former maid to stand here today and humiliate someone for their modest background is not only ironic but deeply hypocritical, Mrs. Joyce said, her voice firm and resolute. "You, who grew up in poverty, should be the last person to judge or belittle others." Tears welled up in my eyes. Her words felt like a balm on the wounds inflicted by Marian's cruelty. The room was heavy with tension. Every guest seemed frozen, hanging on her every word. "We should be proud of Laura," Mrs. Joyce continued, her tone softening but retaining its strength. "Her honesty, her resilience, and her courage are worthy of respect, certainly not of judgment." Marian sat motionless, as if pinned to her chair. Her face was as pale as marble, and she kept her eyes downcast on the table. Beside her, Richard, James's father, looked at Mrs. Joyce with an expression that could only be described as admiration. A murmur began to ripple through the room again. Some guests stole glances at Marian, while most turned to me with newfound warmth. James squeezed my hand, his eyes glowing with gratitude and pride. Mrs. Joyce placed the microphone back on the stand and turned to me, offering a barely perceptible nod. In her gaze, I saw more than words could convey: support, approval, and acceptance. Mrs. Joyce concluded her speech with the same resoluteness with which she had begun, and the silence that followed her words was absolute. I sat beside James, feeling the reassuring strength of his hand clasped firmly over mine beneath the table. It was a silent gesture of support, but also an acknowledgement that this battle was ours together, not mine alone. Marian looked utterly defeated. Her face, usually confident and proud, was now pale and drained. She tried to say something, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Her eyes darted between Mrs. Joyce, Richard, and James, as if searching for support, but no one stepped in to defend her. "This is unfair," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I've always done everything for this family." Mrs. Joyce didn't let her continue. "For this family," she repeated, her voice low and cold, like a blade. "If you truly believe that humiliating Laura in front of everyone was for the good of this family, then you are far more mistaken than I could have imagined." Richard, James's father, nodded again, but this time his gaze was directed firmly at his wife. "You've always spoken about reputation and standards," he said, his voice calm but with each word landing like the strike of a hammer. "But a family's reputation is not built on words spoken in society or on the wealth you've grown accustomed to enjoying. It is earned through the respect we show in our behavior. You've done more damage to that reputation tonight than Laura ever could, even if she tried." Those words hit like a blow, and Marian seemed to feel their weight. Her shoulders sagged, and her eyes filled with tears. The sight might have stirred pity in me, but the memory of her cool words at the wedding was still too raw. "Mother," James said quietly, drawing her attention. His voice was soft, but it carried an unyielding firmness. "Laura and I want one thing: peace. We don't expect your love or approval. But if you truly want to remain part of our lives, you need to change your attitude. Grandma is right. These changes are necessary, not just for us, but for yourself as well." Marian remained silent, her gaze hollow. Her lips pressed into a thin line, as if she were struggling to hold back a torrent of words desperate to escape. But this time, she seemed to understand that any protest would only worsen her position. Mrs. Joyce rose to her feet. She looked unwavering, her stern expression leaving no doubt that her judgment was final. "In this family," she said, looking at each of us in turn, "we value character over wealth and kindness over status. Laura embodies those values, and I am proud to call her part of our family. Marian, I hope you find the strength to learn from this experience." Her words hung in the air, and an oppressive silence once again filled the room. Marian seemed as though she wanted to respond, but then merely gave a slow nod, avoiding everyone's gaze. When James and I returned home, I felt both drained and relieved. We drove in silence the entire way, holding hands, as if that silence was our way of expressing gratitude to one another for the support we'd given each other through that difficult evening. "You're incredible," James finally said as we stepped into our home. His voice was filled with sincerity, and you looked at me as if you were seeing me for the first time. "Me?" I asked, feigning surprise and trying to hide a smile. I just sat there and watched. "But you endured it all," James said, pulling me into a warm, steady embrace. "You endured her words, the stares from all the guests, and you did it with a grace she could never even dream of." I leaned into him, feeling the tension and exhaustion melt away. For the first time in a long while, I felt like our future was clearer. Shirley no longer had power over our lives, and her manipulations had finally been exposed. Mrs. Joyce had not only shielded us, but also given me a new perspective on our relationship. It was stronger than I had ever thought. "Do you think she'll change?" I asked quietly, looking into James's eyes. He sighed, his shoulders rising and falling slightly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But now, that's her choice. We won't be her victims anymore." Those words felt like a turning point for me. Everything I had endured for this love had not been in vain. And even if new challenges awaited us, I knew we would face them together. Returning from our honeymoon, I felt a strange mix of calm and faint unease. The trip had been filled with silence, but it wasn't tense. We were both lost in thought, processing everything that had happened over the past few weeks. James kept his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze focused on the road ahead, but I noticed how he would occasionally glance at me, as if finding comfort in my presence. As we pulled up to his family home, the first thing that struck me was the emptiness. The driveway, usually bustling with activity, servants moving about, windows glowing with muted light, seemed deserted. The house looked almost lifeless, as if all the energy had drained from it the moment we left. "Where's Mom?" James asked quietly as he stepped out of the car. His voice was steady, but I could sense an undertone of concern. We stepped inside, and the silence was palpable. In a house that large, there were always sounds, dishes clinking, footsteps echoing, muffled conversations. But now, it seemed even the echoes hesitated to break the stillness. In the living room, we found Richard. He was sitting in an armchair with a book in his hands, but as soon as he heard our footsteps, he looked up. "You're back," he said, setting the book aside and standing. "How was your honeymoon?" "It was wonderful," I replied, trying to smile. But before I could ask about Shirley, Richard spoke again. "Your mother," he began, glancing at James as if searching for the right words. "She decided to take a little break. She's gone to the lake house for a few weeks." James frowned. The lake house was his mother's favorite retreat, a place she went to when she wanted to be alone. But the decision itself was unusual. Shirley rarely allowed herself to step back, especially after events as public as the scandal at our wedding. "Dad, was it her decision? Or did Grandma push her into it?" James asked cautiously, though his tone carried a firm edge. Richard exhaled deeply. "It was her decision," he said at last. "I think recent events gave her a lot to think about." I noticed how James tensed slightly, but he didn't press further. Instead, he nodded and shifted the conversation to a different topic. In the days that followed, life slowly began to settle into a routine. James and I made an effort to spend more time away from family discussions, focusing instead on the simple joys of our new life together. But Shirley's silence, her absence, lingered like a shadow. Whenever someone mentioned her name, the air in the room seemed to grow colder. One evening, we were sitting in the garden, the sounds of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves creating a soothing backdrop. James held a cup of tea in his hands, and I rested my head on his shoulder. "Do you think Mom will come back different?" he asked, not looking at me. I paused, thinking. Can people truly change? Especially those who have lived a certain way for so long? I wanted to believe that recent events had taught Shirley a lesson, but I also understood that real change requires time and effort. "I don't know, James," I answered honestly. "But maybe time alone will help her see things differently. Sometimes it takes solitude to figure out what really matters." He nodded, and we fell silent again. It was a peaceful silence, as though we both understood that some answers would only come with time. 2 weeks after our return, we received a letter from Shirley. It was unexpected and brief. "I've realized my mistakes. I need more time to understand myself. I'm sorry for everything I've done. I'll return when I can look you in the eye without shame." James read the letter aloud, his voice trembling. He sat silently for a long time, holding the letter in his hands, and then looked at me. "You were right," he said. "Maybe she really is changing." I didn't respond, but deep down, I felt a sense of relief. It was the first step, and while I knew there might still be challenges ahead, I wanted to believe that this was the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. Life slowly began to take on new meaning. I continued learning how to be a part of this family while holding on to my own identity. James and I were building our own traditions, dreaming about the future, and I could feel that our love was only growing stronger. Shirley remained at the lake house, and her absence brought an unusual calm to the family home. Yet, alongside this calm was a quiet hope that her return would mark a change. When we came back home after dinner one evening, I felt a strange mix of relief and tension. The atmosphere in James's family had shifted. Shirley's absence, which at first felt strange and even unsettling, had unexpectedly brought a sense of harmony. There were no more biting comments at the dinner table, no tense stares, and no undercurrents of hostility. Instead, conversations flowed more freely, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that the family was beginning to heal. James was quiet during the drive home. His gaze was fixed on the window, and his fingers tapped rhythmically on the steering wheel, betraying his inner unease. I knew the news he had heard from his grandmother had weighed heavily on him. "All of this, it's just too much," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Too much has happened in such a short time. Mom living in an apartment and looking for a job. Dad thinking about divorce. I knew change was inevitable, but I didn't expect it to happen so abruptly." I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling him relax slightly under my touch. "Change is never easy," I said softly. "But sometimes it's necessary. Maybe for your mom, this is a chance to reassess her life. And for your dad, an opportunity to start fresh." James nodded but said nothing more. His silence was heavy, but I understood that he needed time to process everything. The next day, we returned to Mrs. Joyce's house. She greeted us with her usual warm smile, but there was a noticeable weariness in her eyes. The events of the past few weeks had clearly taken a toll on her as well. She invited us into her cozy sitting room, where the scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint aroma of the old books lining the shelves. "I want to discuss something with you," she began once we had settled in. Her tone was serious but not harsh. "Shirley is going through a difficult time, and as much as it pains me, it's for the best. She needs to understand that family is not just about her comforts and ambitions. It's about responsibility and supporting one another." James exhaled heavily. "I understand, Grandma. But it's hard to accept how far things have gone." Mrs. Joyce looked at him with warmth in her eyes. "Sometimes you have to reach the edge to see the way back, James. I'm confident she'll find her way, but it's something she has to do on her own." Her words seemed to sink into both of us, forcing us to reflect on the idea that true change often requires time and, sometimes, pain. A few days later, we received another letter from Shirley. It was short but far more personal than the first. In it, she thanked us for our patience and asked for a bit more time. Her words felt sincere, and while James remained cautious in his expectations, I could see that deep down, he was hopeful for her return, this time as a different person. Meanwhile, quiet changes continued to unfold in Mrs. Joyce's house. Richard spent more and more time in his study, but his presence in the family became noticeably different. He was attentive, empathetic, and even offered to help me with one of my small projects. It was an unexpected gesture, and I felt that he, too, was trying to contribute to the creation of a new family dynamic. One evening, as James and I were having dinner at our home, he spoke about the future unexpectedly. "Laura," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I think we should start building something of our own. Our family's history will always be with us, but I want us to have something that's just ours." His words were surprising, but I immediately understood what he meant. He wasn't just talking about a home or a business. He was talking about creating a life based on our own values, not the legacy of his family. "I agree," I replied with a smile. "I think we've already started. Every step we take together is part of our story." He reached out and touched my hand. His eyes were filled with a quiet confidence, and I felt his warmth pass through me. "Then let's not stop," he said. "I want us to create something real, Laura. A family that represents everything we believe in: honesty, love, respect." His words resonated deeply in my heart. I felt that everything we had been through had made us stronger. And while new challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, I knew we would face them together. We entered the house, and its silence seemed to echo within us. The spacious rooms felt larger than usual, as if the atmosphere itself was anticipating something new. In the foyer, we were greeted by Mrs. Joyce. She was sitting in her favorite chair with a book in hand, but as soon as she heard our footsteps, she set it aside and stood up. "Welcome home, dears," she said with a gentle smile. "How are you? Was your honeymoon everything you dreamed of?" "Even better," James replied, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. "It was exactly what we needed." Mrs. Joyce nodded, as though understanding more than we were saying. Her eyes lingered on us for a moment longer than usual, and I could sense that there was a question behind her gaze, one she wasn't yet ready to voice. After all, she had been the catalyst for these changes, the person who had dared to shake the established order and forced each of us to see ourselves in a new light. "You're probably wondering what's changed here while you've been away," she said, gesturing for us to follow her into the sitting room. We walked behind her, and I felt James squeeze my hand a little tighter, as if bracing himself for whatever was to come. We sat down on the sofa, while Mrs. Joyce took a seat across from us. Her posture was impeccable, though there was a faint trace of weariness in her movements. "I'll start with Shirley," she began, but hesitated. Her eyes lingered on James. "She's still on her break, if you can call it that." James frowned but stayed silent, letting his grandmother continue. "After you left, as you might imagine, she wasn't in the best frame of mind. She came to me, demanding that I restore her financial support," Mrs. Joyce said with a faint smirk. "I refused. She caused quite a scene, but I held my ground. In the end, she decided to leave. She's now living in a small apartment that she rents herself, and, as far as I know, she's actively looking for a job." I felt the air in the room grow heavier with surprise. James turned to me, his eyes wide. "A job," he repeated, as if the very word seemed implausible when applied to his mother. Mrs. Joyce gave a slight nod, her expression remaining calm. "Yes, a job. Perhaps it's exactly what she needs. Of course, it hasn't been easy for her, but I believe this will make her stronger." James leaned back against the sofa, staring up at the ceiling thoughtfully. I could see the weight of those words settling in his mind, as he tried to reconcile them with the image of the mother he had always known. This is so unlike her," he finally said. "People change, James," Mrs. Joyce said softly. "Especially when they're forced to confront a reality they've never had to face before." Her words left a sense of something larger looming in the air, something that had only just begun. I thought of Shirley, imagining her in a completely different life, far removed from the luxury she had surrounded herself with for so many years. Perhaps she would find something more meaningful in this new world, not just a job, but simple joys she had never noticed before. "And my father?" James asked, sitting up slightly. "Has he said anything? Have they been in touch?" Mrs. Joyce lowered her gaze to her folded hands. "Richard is keeping his distance for now. He's made it clear to her that he, too, needs a change. I believe he's still considering the possibility of divorce." Those words made James flinch, as if the weight of that realization physically hit him. I placed a hand on his knee, trying to convey warmth and support. "This won't be easy for any of us," Mrs. Joyce continued. "But I believe these changes will bring us more than just pain. They will bring understanding, a new beginning." That evening, when we were alone in our room, James looked deeply lost in thought. He stood by the window, staring out at the dimly lit garden, unaware of the evening chill creeping into the room. I walked over and wrapped my arms around him from behind, resting my head on his shoulder. "You'll get through this, James," I said softly. "It's hard, but you're strong. You've always been strong." He turned to me, his eyes glistening with emotions he was trying to keep hidden. "You're my strength, Laura," he whispered, pulling me closer. "I couldn't do this without you." We stood there in that moment, feeling our hearts beat in unison. The world around us was changing, crumbling, and rebuilding itself, but I knew that our bond remained unshaken.